The moment Grant Halloway walked through those double doors in a suit that cost more than my entire annual salary, the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding against my ribs, and I watched the color drain from my ex-fiancé's face as he realized the man he had spent the last 10 minutes mocking me in front of was about to shake his hand and call me the greatest gift of his life. Before I take you into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet hope that carries people through their darkest days, I want to ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community here means more to me than numbers ever could, and every single one of you who takes a moment to do that helps stories like this one reach someone who might desperately need to hear it. Now, let me tell you how I ended up standing in that banquet hall, shaking, humiliated, and completely unaware that my life was about to change forever. My name is Claire Bennett, and 10 years ago I graduated from Ashford High School in a small town in Ohio with dreams that felt enormous at the time but, looking back, were really just the ordinary dreams of an ordinary girl who wanted to be loved and to matter to someone. I had been dating Trevor Ladd since junior year, the kind of boy who wore his Letterman jacket like a crown and believed, with the arrogant certainty of 18-year-olds everywhere, that he was destined for something bigger than our town could offer. I believed it too. I believed in him with the whole of my young heart, the way you believe in the first person who ever tells you that you are beautiful and means it, or seems to mean it, which at 17 is close enough to the truth that you don't ask questions. We dated all through those last years of high school, and when he left for college in Chicago while I stayed behind to help care for my mother, who had been diagnosed with a slow and cruel illness that ate away at her strength a little more every season, I told myself that distance was just a test, and that love which was real could survive any test. I worked 2 jobs during those years, one at the diner off Route 9 and another cleaning offices on the weekends, because my mother's medical bills piled up faster than either of us could keep track of, and my father had left when I was 9 years old and never once looked back. I did not resent the sacrifice. I loved my mother fiercely, and there was a strange, quiet dignity in showing up for someone who needed me, even when my body ached and my hands cracked from cleaning solution and my eyes burned from exhaustion at 2 in the morning. Trevor called less and less. I told myself he was busy. I told myself that college was demanding and that when he graduated he would come home and we would build the life we had always talked about, the little house with the porch swing, the golden retriever, the 2 kids we had named before we were even old enough to legally get married. But 3 years into his time in Chicago, he called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice flat and rehearsed in a way that told me he had practiced this call, and he told me that he had met someone else, someone whose father owned a chain of car dealerships, someone who understood, as he put it, the kind of life I'm trying to build. He said it so casually, as though he were explaining why he'd switched his major, and I remember standing in my mother's kitchen with the phone pressed so hard against my ear that it left a mark, listening to the boy I had loved since I was 16 years old dismantle 5 years of my life in under 2 minutes. I did not cry in front of him. I have always been proud, perhaps too proud, and something in me refused to give him the satisfaction of hearing my voice break. I said only that I hoped he would be happy, and I hung up the phone, and then I sat down on the kitchen floor and cried until my mother, weak as she was, crawled out of her bed to hold me, her thin arms wrapped around my shoulders while she whispered that any man who could walk away from a heart as loyal as mine did not deserve the privilege of breaking it, and that one day I would understand this moment not as an ending but as a mercy in disguise. I did not believe her then. Grief has a way of making wisdom sound like a lie. My mother passed away 18 months later, on a gray October morning with rain tapping softly against the hospital window, and her hand in mine grew cold while I begged her silently not to leave me, not when I had already lost so much, not when I was only 23 years old and already felt like I had lived 3 difficult lifetimes. After the funeral, I sold the small house we had rented for years, paid off what remained of her medical debt, and moved to Columbus with nothing but 2 suitcases and a determination that had hardened into something unbreakable inside me. I told myself that grief and heartbreak were not going to be the entire story of my life, even if, some nights, it felt like they might be. I took a job as a receptionist at a mid-sized architecture firm, answering phones and organizing files for people who barely looked at me, and I enrolled in night classes to finish the business degree I had abandoned when my mother first got sick. It took me 4 more years, 4 years of 16-hour days, of falling asleep over textbooks with highlighters still in my hand, of turning down every invitation to go out because I could not afford either the time or the money, but I finished. I graduated with honors at 27 years old, walking across a stage while a small handful of co-workers who had become something like a found family cheered for me from the audience, and for the first time in years I let myself feel something like pride. It was around that time that I met Grant Halloway, though not in the way you might expect from a man who would later be described in business magazines as one of the most influential young entrepreneurs in the country. I did not meet him at a gala or a boardroom or some glittering event where powerful people mingle. I met him on a Tuesday afternoon in the pouring rain outside a coffee shop, when his car, a sleek black sedan that I later learned was worth more than most houses, had a flat tire, and he was standing there in a soaked dress shirt, laughing at his own bad luck instead of cursing it, while I, on my lunch break with an umbrella and absolutely no obligation to help a stranger, found myself offering to hold that umbrella over him while he waited for roadside assistance. He asked why I was helping a total stranger instead of hurrying back to work and staying dry, and I told him, half joking, that anyone who could laugh at a flat tire in the middle of a downpour probably deserved a little kindness from the universe. He looked at me for a long moment, rain dripping from his dark hair, and something in his expression shifted from amusement into something quieter and more curious, and he asked if he could buy me a coffee sometime to thank me. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it, mostly because there was something in his eyes that reminded me, oddly, of my mother's laugh, a kind of warmth that felt safe rather than performative. I did not know, that first day, that Grant Halloway had built a technology company from a garage with 2 friends and a second-hand server, and that within a decade it had grown into an empire worth billions of dollars. I did not know because he never once, in the months that followed, made me feel small or unworthy or like an outsider looking into a world I did not belong in. He asked about my mother. He listened, really listened, when I told him about the diner and the office cleaning jobs and the nights I studied until my eyes blurred. He never flinched when I told him about Trevor, about the humiliation of being discarded for someone whose father owned car dealerships, and he never once tried to buy my healing with expensive gifts or grand gestures, though I later learned he certainly could have. Instead, he showed up. He showed up with soup when I had the flu. He showed up to help me carry boxes when I finally moved into a slightly bigger apartment. He showed up on the anniversary of my mother's death without me even telling him the date, because he had quietly written it down the first time I mentioned it in passing, and he sat with me in silence in a small park while I cried for a woman he had never met but somehow understood mattered more to me than anyone else in the world. We married 2 years after that rainy afternoon, in a small ceremony with fewer than 40 guests, in a garden behind a restored farmhouse that Grant had bought specifically because it reminded me of the porch swing house I used to dream about with Trevor, though I did not tell him that until much later, and when I did, he simply held my hand and said that dream deserved to come true even if it came true with the wrong man's memory attached to it, because now it belonged only to us. He never once used his wealth as a weapon or a boundary between himself and the people I loved. He kept his empire mostly private, avoided tabloids and interviews when he could, and insisted that our life together feel, as much as possible, like an ordinary life built by 2 ordinary people who happened to fall in love in the rain. It was my old classmate Renata Michaels, a woman I had been mildly friendly with in high school but had not spoken to in nearly a decade, who tracked me down through social media and invited me to our 10-year reunion, insisting with a warmth I now understand was at least partly curiosity that everyone would love to see how I had turned out. I almost said no. Reunions had never interested me, and the last thing I wanted was to walk back into a room full of people who remembered me as the girl whose fiancé left her for a car dealership heiress, the girl who spent her early 20s cleaning offices and burying her mother instead of building a glamorous life like everyone assumed she would. But something in me, some old wound that had never fully closed, wanted to see it through. I wanted to know if I could walk into that room and feel proud of the woman I had become, regardless of what anyone else thought of her. Grant was traveling for a conference that week and could not attend, and I told him honestly that I did not need him there, that this was something I wanted to face on my own terms, to prove to myself, more than anyone, that I no longer needed anyone's presence to feel whole. The reunion was held in a banquet hall attached to our old high school, decorated with blue and gold balloons that clashed a little sadly with the beige carpet, and the moment I walked in, wearing a simple green dress that I had chosen because it made me feel like myself rather than like someone performing wealth or success, I felt eyes turn toward me the way they always do when a room recognizes a face it has spent years speculating about. Renata found me first, hugging me tightly and telling me I looked wonderful, and for a while the evening felt almost pleasant, filled with the particular nostalgia of seeing people who once knew you as an entirely different version of yourself, some of them kinder with age, some of them exactly as shallow as they had been at 18. And then Trevor Ladd walked in. He had aged in the way some men do when life has been generous to them without demanding much growth in return, still handsome, still carrying himself with that same easy confidence, though there was something slightly hollow behind his eyes now, something I recognized because I had once loved him enough to memorize every version of his face. He was alone, which surprised me until Renata whispered that his marriage to the car dealership heiress had ended 2 years earlier, apparently after it became clear that her father's business connections were the only thing keeping Trevor afloat professionally, and that he had struggled since then to hold down steady work, bouncing between sales jobs and short-lived business ventures that never quite took off. I felt, in that moment, no triumph, no satisfaction, only a strange and distant pity, the kind you feel for a stranger rather than someone who once broke your heart into pieces on your mother's kitchen floor. But pity was not what Trevor wanted from me, and it became clear within minutes that he had walked into that room already prepared to rewrite the story of our past into something that made him feel less like a man whose life had quietly unraveled. He approached me with a drink in his hand and a smile that did not reach his eyes, and in front of a small cluster of former classmates who had gathered near the appetizer table, he began, loudly enough for others to hear, to reminisce about our high school relationship in a tone dripping with condescension, saying things like how sweet it was that I had always been so devoted, so eager to please, so willing to work myself to the bone for people who never fully appreciated it, and wasn't it funny, he said, how some people just never managed to escape the small-town life they were born into, no matter how hard they try. He asked, with theatrical sympathy, whether I was still cleaning offices, whether I had ever managed to finish that degree I used to talk about, whether I had found someone willing to take on a woman who came with, as he put it, so much baggage. I felt heat rise in my chest, the old humiliation clawing its way back up through years of healing, and for a moment I was 23 again, sitting on that kitchen floor with the phone in my hand, small and discarded and not enough. A few people laughed nervously, the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort rather than amusement, and Renata shot me an apologetic look, clearly regretting having invited me into this. I opened my mouth to respond, though I honestly did not know what words would come out, whether I would defend myself with dignity or simply walk away and let him have his small, sad victory, because sometimes the years teach you that not every battle deserves your energy. But before I could speak, the doors at the far end of the banquet hall opened, and the room, quite literally, went still. Grant Halloway stood in the doorway in a charcoal suit, having flown back early from his conference specifically to surprise me, a bouquet of white ranunculus, my favorite flower, held loosely in one hand, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found mine, softening instantly with a warmth so genuine it made my throat tighten. He was not a man who needed to announce himself. His presence simply did that on its own. Several people in the room recognized him immediately, not from any personal connection, but from magazine covers and business news segments, and I watched, almost in slow motion, as whispers rippled outward, as people who moments earlier had been laughing at Trevor's jokes now stared with open astonishment, piecing together, in real time, exactly who I had married. Trevor's face went through several transformations in the span of a few seconds, confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked uncomfortably close to fear, as Grant crossed the room with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed to prove himself to anyone, and stopped directly beside me, pressing a soft kiss to my temple before handing me the flowers and turning, with perfect politeness, toward Trevor, extending his hand as though he were simply being introduced to an old friend of mine rather than the man who had once discarded me like something disposable. Grant did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said, simply, that he had heard so much about the people I grew up with, and that he had always wanted to personally thank whoever it was that had once made the mistake of letting someone as extraordinary as Claire Bennett go, because that mistake, he said, was the reason he got to spend the rest of his life with her instead. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, and Trevor, visibly sweating now, mumbled something incoherent about being happy for us, his earlier bravado utterly evaporated, replaced by the particular shame of a man who has just watched, in front of an entire room of witnesses, everything he once mocked walk in wearing a better suit than his own and holding a hand he could never have earned the right to hold. I want to pause here, before I tell you what happened next, because I think this is the moment worth sitting with. It would have been easy, so easy, for me to feel triumphant in that moment, to let 10 years of buried hurt curdle into cruelty, to look at Trevor's humiliated face and feel the kind of satisfaction that so many of us secretly crave when someone who hurt us finally gets what we believe they deserve. And for a brief, human moment, I did feel something like that, a flash of vindication hot and bright in my chest. But it did not last, because looking at Trevor in that moment, stripped of his confidence, visibly diminished in front of people whose opinions he had always cared about far too much, I did not see an enemy. I saw a man who had built his entire identity on the approval of others, who had chased status instead of substance, who had traded a love that was real and steady for a life that ultimately left him alone and struggling, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that his cruelty toward me that evening had never really been about me at all. It was about his own unresolved shame, his own quiet awareness that he had made a devastating mistake a decade ago and had spent every year since then trying to convince himself, and everyone around him, that he hadn't. Grant, sensing the shift in me, gently squeezed my hand, silently offering to let me lead whatever happened next. I took a breath, and instead of the sharp retort that some small, wounded part of me wanted to deliver, I spoke to Trevor with a steadiness that surprised even myself, telling him that I hoped he would find whatever peace he was looking for, that I no longer carried any anger toward him, and that the years he had spent doubting me had, strangely, been the making of me, because they had taught me how to survive without depending on anyone else's validation, and that lesson had turned out to be the greatest gift he had ever given me, even if neither of us understood it at the time. I told him, gently, that I hoped he would learn to build his self-worth on something sturdier than other people's admiration, because admiration is fickle and conditional, but the kind of love that stays through illness and grief and long, difficult years of rebuilding, the kind Grant had shown me, that was the only thing worth chasing in this life. The room was quiet in a different way now, not the shocked silence of gossip but something more reverent, and I noticed Renata wiping at her eyes, and a few of my other former classmates nodding slowly, as though something in my words had reached past the surface entertainment of the evening's drama and touched something more universal in them, some private heartbreak or humiliation of their own that they recognized in my story. Trevor, to his credit, did not try to salvage his pride with another joke or dismissive comment. He simply nodded, his eyes glassy, and said, quietly, that he was sorry, not just for tonight, but for the phone call 10 years ago, for the years of silence before that, for never once checking on me after my mother passed even though he had heard about it through mutual friends. It was not a dramatic apology. It did not erase a decade of pain in a single sentence. But it was honest, and in its own small way, it was enough. Grant did not gloat. He did not need to, and that, I think, was the truest measure of the man I had married, because a smaller man, a man who needed his wealth to be a weapon rather than simply a fact of his life, might have used that moment to humiliate Trevor further, to remind him in front of everyone exactly how far he had fallen while I had risen. Instead, Grant simply asked if I wanted to stay a little longer or if I would rather leave, and when I told him I was ready to go, he thanked Renata for hosting such a memorable evening with a warmth that made her blush, and led me out of that banquet hall with his hand resting lightly on the small of my back, the same way he had rested it there every single day for the 6 years we had been together, in private and in public, whether cameras were watching or not. We did not speak much in the car at first. The late afternoon sun was beginning to soften into that golden hour light that Ohio does so beautifully in early autumn, and I watched the familiar streets of my hometown pass by the window, streets I had walked 1,000 times as a heartbroken 23-year-old with nothing but grief and determination to keep me moving forward. Grant reached over at a red light and took my hand, not saying anything at first, simply holding it the way he always did, as though my hand belonged naturally in his, as though 6 years had not diminished even slightly his instinct to reach for me. When he finally spoke, he asked if I was okay, and I found, to my own surprise, that I meant it completely when I told him yes, that I felt lighter than I had in years, as though some old weight I had been carrying without even realizing it had finally been set down. I told him, as we drove, about my mother, about the years of cleaning offices and studying at 2 in the morning, about the particular loneliness of being discarded by someone you loved during the hardest season of your life. I had told him pieces of this story before, of course, over the years we had been together, but there was something different about telling it now, in the aftermath of finally facing the person who had caused so much of that pain, something that felt less like reopening a wound and more like closing one properly for the first time. Grant listened the way he always listened, with his full attention, occasionally asking a gentle question, never rushing me toward some tidy conclusion, and when I finished, he told me something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said that the woman he fell in love with on that rainy afternoon outside the coffee shop was not a woman without struggle or hardship, but a woman who had been through devastating loss and come out the other side still capable of offering kindness to a stranger, still capable of holding an umbrella over someone else's head even when no one had ever really held one over hers, and that this, more than any success or accomplishment, was what had made him fall for me so completely and so quickly. He said that watching me speak to Trevor tonight, with grace instead of cruelty, had only confirmed what he already knew, that I was the strongest and gentlest person he had ever met, and that those two qualities, strength and gentleness together, were far rarer and far more valuable than anything money could ever buy. We stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, not unlike the one I had worked at all those years ago, because I told him I wanted to eat somewhere ordinary, somewhere that felt like the life I had actually lived rather than the life people now assumed I had married into. We sat in a booth by the window, sharing a plate of fries the way we used to on our early dates before either of us had much money to spare, and I found myself laughing, really laughing, for what felt like the first time in years, the sound surprising even me with its lightness. Grant told me, over pie, about the early years of his company, about the nights he slept on the floor of his garage because he could not afford both rent and the equipment he needed, about the string of failures and rejections he endured before anything finally worked, and I realized, listening to him, that his success had never been handed to him either, that beneath the expensive suits and the private planes was a man who understood struggle just as intimately as I did, which was perhaps why he had never once looked down on the parts of my past that other people might have considered shameful. It was later that week, after the reunion had become something of a quiet local legend, whispered about in grocery store aisles and passed along through group chats among people who had witnessed it firsthand, that Renata called me, her voice hesitant, to tell me something that added an unexpected layer to the story. She told me that Trevor had reached out to her after the reunion, asking, almost sheepishly, for my email address, not to reconnect romantically, she clarified quickly, but because he wanted to write me a proper letter, something he said he should have done years ago. I debated for several days whether to give her permission to share my contact information, uncertain whether reopening any line of communication with him would help or hurt the peace I had only just found, but eventually, after talking it through with Grant, who told me the decision was entirely mine to make and that he would support whatever I chose, I agreed. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, handwritten on plain notebook paper rather than typed, which somehow made it feel more genuine. In it, Trevor wrote about the years since our breakup with an honesty I did not expect from him, admitting that he had chased the life he thought he was supposed to want, a life built on money and status and other people's admiration, and that it had left him hollow in ways he had not fully understood until his own marriage collapsed and he found himself, for the first time in his adult life, completely alone with no one's approval to hide behind. He wrote that seeing me at the reunion, seeing the quiet strength in the way I carried myself, the grace in how I had responded to his cruelty, had forced him to confront just how much he had thrown away, not romantically, he clarified, because he understood that ship had sailed long ago and that I was deeply, rightfully happy with someone else, but in terms of the person he could have become if he had chosen loyalty and kindness over ambition and image all those years ago. He said he had started seeing a therapist, something he admitted he once would have considered a sign of weakness, and that he was trying, slowly, to rebuild his sense of self-worth on something more solid than what other people thought of him. He thanked me, somewhat awkwardly but sincerely, for not humiliating him further at the reunion when I so easily could have, and said that my grace that evening had taught him something about character that all his years of chasing status never had. I sat with that letter for a long time after reading it, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions that I did not fully expect. There was no lingering romantic feeling. That particular ember had gone cold many years earlier, and Grant had, quite thoroughly, filled every space in my heart that once belonged to Trevor. But there was something like closure in it, something like the final, gentle click of a door that had been left slightly ajar for a decade finally settling shut. I wrote him back a short letter, wishing him genuine peace and growth, telling him that I forgave him not because what he did hadn't hurt, but because carrying that hurt any longer no longer served the life I was building, and that I hoped he would eventually learn to extend himself the same grace he was finally learning to extend to others. In the months that followed, my life continued in ways both ordinary and remarkable. Grant and I began quietly expanding a foundation we had started a few years earlier, one that provided financial assistance and support services to families caring for loved ones with chronic illness, a cause that had grown directly out of my own memories of watching my mother struggle without adequate support, of the exhaustion and financial devastation that caregiving can bring to families who are already stretched thin. We funded scholarships for young caregivers who, like me, had to pause their education to care for sick family members, and every time I read an application from some exhausted, determined young person trying to hold their family together while still dreaming of something more for themselves, I saw pieces of my own younger self reflected back, and it filled something in me that all the wealth in the world could never have filled on its own. Renata and I grew closer in the years after the reunion, an unexpected friendship blooming from what had once been only a passing acquaintance, and she confided in me one afternoon over coffee that watching how I handled that evening, with dignity rather than vengeance, had changed something in how she approached her own difficult relationships, including a strained one with her sister that she had been avoiding repairing for years out of pride. She told me that she finally reached out, finally had the difficult conversation she had been avoiding, and that some of the courage to do so had come from watching me choose grace over triumph in a room full of people who would have understood, and even celebrated, if I had chosen otherwise. As for Trevor, I heard through occasional mutual updates that he had, slowly and imperfectly, begun rebuilding his life on steadier ground, taking a stable job with a local nonprofit, something far removed from the flashy sales positions and business ventures he used to chase, and that he had started volunteering, of all things, at a support center for people going through divorce, using his own painful experience to help others navigate theirs. I do not know if he ever fully became the man he could have been all those years ago, and it is not my responsibility to measure his growth or hold the door open to a relationship beyond the occasional, distant update. But I found, when I thought about him now, that the bitterness had genuinely faded, replaced by something closer to quiet gratitude, the strange and humbling gratitude you feel toward a painful chapter of your life once you understand it was necessary to bring you to where you are now. Grant and I welcomed our first child 2 years after that reunion, a daughter we named Josephine, after my mother, whose full name had been Josephine Bennett, though everyone had always called her Josie. I remember holding her for the first time in the hospital, exhausted and overwhelmed with a love so enormous it frightened me, and thinking about how strange and beautiful the architecture of a life can be, how a single phone call on a Tuesday evening a decade earlier, a call that had once felt like the end of everything good in my life, had actually been the first domino in a long chain of events that led me here, to this hospital room, to this daughter, to this husband who had never once made me feel like anything less than extraordinary. My mother would have loved Josephine fiercely, would have spoiled her terribly, and there are still days when the grief of her absence catches me by surprise, sharp and sudden, usually in small moments, watching Josephine do something that reminds me of her grandmother's mannerisms despite never having met her. But even that grief, these days, feels less like an open wound and more like a scar I have made peace with, evidence of a love so deep it left a permanent mark, which is, I have come to believe, exactly what love is supposed to do. I think often about what my life would have looked like if Trevor had never left, if I had married him instead of building the life I eventually built with Grant, and I no longer feel any temptation to romanticize that alternate path. I understand now, with the clarity that only years and distance can provide, that the version of myself who might have married Trevor at 23 would have spent years slowly shrinking herself to fit into a life built around someone else's ambition and image, and that the woman I became instead, forged through grief and struggle and years of hard-won independence, was infinitely stronger and infinitely more herself than that other version could ever have been. Sometimes the doors that slam shut in our faces, however devastating in the moment, are simply the universe redirecting us toward the life we were actually meant to build. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it is that the people who discard you, who mock you, who make you feel small during your most vulnerable seasons, are very rarely a measure of your worth, and are very often simply revealing the limitations of their own capacity to love. Your value does not diminish because someone failed to recognize it. Sometimes the very qualities that someone once mocked in you, your loyalty, your work ethic, your refusal to abandon the people who need you, are the exact qualities that will eventually build the life you were always meant to have, even if that life takes a long and painful road to arrive. And when it finally does arrive, when you find yourself standing tall in a room that once tried to make you feel small, I hope you choose, as I did, grace over cruelty, not because the person who hurt you deserves it, but because you deserve to be the kind of person whose strength never requires someone else's humiliation to feel complete. Before I close this story, I would love to hear from you. If you have ever walked into a room where someone once doubted you, once mocked you, once made you feel like you would never amount to anything, and you found yourself standing there transformed into someone stronger than they ever imagined, I want you to leave a comment below and tell me about that moment, because I believe those stories, our stories, are what remind us that healing is always possible, that dignity can survive even the deepest wounds, and that grace, real grace, is one of the most powerful forms of strength a person can carry. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your own experience, share it with someone in your life who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our family here, this community we have built together around stories of kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, means more to me than I can properly express, and every single person who takes the time to engage with these stories helps them reach someone out there who desperately needs to be reminded that their hardest chapters are not the end of their story. Thank you for walking through this journey with me today, for sitting with Claire's grief and her healing in her hard-won grace, and I will see you in the next story, where I hope, once again, we can remind each other that love, real love, patient and steady and kind, always finds its way to those who never stopped believing it was possible.